Hi, my name's Rick Davies, and this is a presentation about using MSC stories to develop candidate theories around the idea of what works in what situation and why. It's very much a work in progress. When we talk about candidate theories, we're not talking about proven theories, but theories which seem to work in some situations and are worth testing out on a larger scale to see whether they hold. In this presentation, I'll be making use of a realist evaluation perspective. We will be looking for theories of change that have three elements: some information about the context, information about the intervention that took place, and the outcome that resulted. And underlying those three things will be some knowledge of the causal mechanisms that connected these events. Here is an example. A woman from a particular village, that's the context, joins a savings and credit group organised by an NGO, that's the intervention, and as a result is able to increase her monthly income, that's the outcome. The underlying mechanisms might be like this. She joined the group as a result of her neighbour introducing her to the group, and once she joined the group she was able to increase her monthly income because she was able to get good advice on marketing opportunities. Where will we find these elements or parts of theories of change? Well, hopefully we will find them in most of the most significant change stories that we're looking at. We should at least be able to find an outcome of interest and some information about the events that led to that outcome, and hopefully some background context, although it's not unusual to find the background context missing or described very briefly. When we look through all the MSC stories, we can code in a data sheet the presence or absence of different types of outcomes and different types of events and different types of background contexts. And that will generate a data set that we can analyze using a range of methods, one of which I'll describe later in this presentation. Here is an example of one data set that was generated by some people from Results in Health, a Dutch NGO, when they looked at a set of MSC stories collected by Oxfam in Sulawesi in Indonesia. You can see the titles of the stories listed down the left side, and across the top are different aspects of the stories, different features of the stories which were of interest. The ones in pink, the first 5 columns, are aspects of descriptions of what was going on inside the group, and the column on the right is an outcome description, in this case improved gender equality. The cells contain zeros and ones, and that basically means either that attribute was present or not. For example, one column says enterprise profits shared or not, so 1 indicates that in that story enterprise profits were shared, and a 0 indicates that they weren't. There are 3 challenges which we need to deal with. The first is making some decisions about what features of the stories are important and the ones that we want to record. The second challenge is how can we code the presence or absence of these aspects of these stories in a way that's consistent across all the stories that we're looking at. And the third is how do we analyze the data to find configurations that might be common across a number of stories. There are different ways of selecting the features within the MSC stories that we want to code and then later analyze. One approach is what you might call a technical approach. This is where an expert or an outsider looks carefully at the stories, reads through them, and forms their own judgment about what it is in the story that is of particular interest. When they're doing that, they might make reference to the existing theory of change that relates to a project where these stories come from, or they might look through the wider literature regarding the sorts of interventions that are being undertaken in the project and pick up ideas there about the important aspects of the stories that need to be identified and recorded. The other approach is what you might call a participatory approach, where people who've written the stories or stakeholders who are concerned with the events in the stories undertake some analysis of those stories. And they might do that, for example, by undertaking a pile or card sorting exercise where they group all the stories into different groups according to the types of outcomes that they have in common. And they might also carry out something called a hierarchical card sort to identify the most significant differences between the causes of those outcomes. Once we've identified the features of MSC stories that we're interested in, we then have to systematically identify and record where those features are present and where they are absent. And we do this by a process of coding, and this can be done in different ways. the outcomes of stories, we can approach this by ranking the stories in terms of their relative success, and we can define this in a very specific way, looking at specific dimensions of success, or we could look at success in more aggregate terms in the way that you do when you're making choices about which story is most significant in a most significant change selection exercise. Once we've got a ranking of the relative success that's present in the different stories, if we need to, we can then convert those ranking values into a binary form. We can dichotomize them. We can split them into two groups of high versus low success. We also need to code the context and intervention features that we see in the stories, and we can code these as being present or absent by using a 0 or 1, or if there's some uncertainty in the extent to which they're present or absent, we can use intermediate values. So we can use values like 0, 0.33, 0.66, and 1. The important point to note here is that the coding of features of stories takes time to do properly, and it's often useful to do reliability checks by having someone else do the coding of the same story and then checking how the two sets of codings compare to each other. Because it takes time and you need to be careful about errors and reliability, it's important to make sure that you choose the features that you're coding quite carefully. The third challenge is analysis. Once we've looked at the stories, identified the features which we think are important, then systematically coded all the stories for the presence or absence of the features that we're interested in, we have a data set. Then the question is, how do we analyze that data set to identify the candidate theories of change that might be of interest to us? Those theories of change will be simplified descriptions of what is happening in stories, configurations of features that seem to fit multiple stories. There are three methods that can be used. One is called qualitative comparative analysis, which is a theory-driven method and which comes out of the field of political science. The second is decision tree algorithms, and this comes from the field of data mining and is more data-driven. And the third are hierarchical card sorting combined with success ranking, and this is a more participatory method. The first two of these methods make use of the data set of the kind that you saw earlier in this presentation, whereas the third one doesn't make use of that data set, but one of the results of the third method, the hierarchical card sorting method, is a data set which can then be reanalyzed by these other two methods. In other words, the results can be triangulated using those other two methods. I'm not going to be discussing qualitative comparative analysis or decision tree algorithms in this presentation. The rest of the presentation will be about hierarchical card sorting combined with success ranking, but there are a few references to these other two methods at the end of the presentation. The process of using hierarchical card sorting and success ranking involves 4 steps. The first is to generate a tree structure which reflects participants' views of the most significant differences in the project context or interventions that are described in the set of stories that are being looked at. Then the next step, once the tree structure is developed, is to ask at each branch point in the tree for predictions about the relative success of the types of stories that are covered by each branch. You'll see an example of the tree structure that I'm talking about in the next slide. The third step is then to gather data on the observed outcomes in those stories using success ranking. And the fourth step is to compare the predicted and observed outcomes, to compare the results from the tree structure predictions to the results generated by the success ranking. Here is an example of the results of our hierarchical card sorting of a set of most significant change stories. It's a fictional example. The card sorting process starts off with all the stories put in one big group, and that's the group at the top called all the MSC stories. Participants are then asked to split all those stories into 2 groups according to what they think is the most significant difference in the context or the intervention that might make a difference to the outcomes in those stories. And in this case, they've sort of separated them into 2 groups, stories concerning men and stories concerning women. Then the process proceeds in the same way, just repeating the same questions. So With the group of stories all to do with women, the participants are asked again to split that group of stories into two subgroups according to the most significant difference in either the context or the intervention that makes a difference to the outcome. And in this case, they've split the stories into stories about production activities and stories about savings and credit activities. And so the process keeps repeating. You keep asking the participants to split the groups of stories into smaller and smaller subgroups of stories until there's only one story in each subgroup left, or until, even if there may be two stories in a subgroup, they can't identify any significant difference. So in this example here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 final groups of stories, each characterized by multiple labels in the tree structure. So we've got stories which are about men who are in new groups, and the storyteller is an ordinary member of that group. Or we've got another group of stories which are about women involved in production activities, and those production activities are collective activities. This slide describes the second step in the process. Once we've got the tree structure, we then ask the participants to walk down the tree structure and ask one question at each juncture in the tree structure, and that question is spelt out on the top of the slide. The question is, which of these types of stories do you think will have the most successful outcome? So starting at the top, we would ask the participants to compare the stories which are about men versus the stories about women, and make a judgment about where they think they would find the most successful outcomes. And in this case here, the choice has been of the stories about women. So again, having got to that point, we would then ask the participants to look at the two subgroups of stories, those concerned with production activities and those concerned with savings and credit focused activities, and ask them to identify where they would expect to find the most successful outcomes, which types of stories they would expect to find the most successful outcomes, either in the production group of stories or the savings and credit group of stories. And in this case, they've selected the production group of stories. And again, we would repeat that question, asking them to make a choice between collective activities and individual activities, and so on. So we would do this process at all points in the tree, so it was clear for every junction in the tree which of the two options the participants thought would lead to the more successful outcomes. In the diagram that you can see here in front of you, the results of all those choices have been documented by color coding red for most successful and black for less successful. In this next slide, I want to show you how we can obtain a full success ranking of all the types of stories from the individual binary choices that were made in the previous slide. If we look at the tree and follow the red lines, which are the choices where the participants said these particular types of stories will be associated with more successful outcomes compared to the black stories, we can go down the line which shows women's stories, and then the subtype of those concerned with production and the subtype concerned with individual activities. So that is the number one ranking type of story. This is where we will find the most successful outcomes according to the views of the participants. The collective activities were a second choice amongst all the production orientated activities, so that becomes the second ranking type of story. To find a third ranking, we need to go back up the tree to the group of stories about women and look at their second choice there, which was savings and credit focused stories. And then amongst those, we look at their first choices, which were bigger scale activity, and then amongst those involving smaller groups. So we give that a third rank. The second choice amongst those bigger scale savings and credit focused activities was those involving big groups of members. So that becomes the fourth rank. And then to get the fifth rank, we go back to the savings and credit group and look at their second choice there, which was small scale savings and credit activities. So that becomes the fifth rank. So we can generate a full ranking of all the types of stories in terms of the expected degree of success of the outcomes of those stories by looking at where the position of each type of story is within the tree structure. Another point which I want to make at this point is that if we look at each branch of the tree, we're in effect looking at a particular theory of change, a particular configuration of circumstances which leads to a particular type of outcome. I've given one example at the bottom of this slide which says, if the stories are about women involving production activities which are carried out by individuals, then the outcome in those stories will be the most successful compared to the other stories. In this next slide, I want to step back a bit to give a wider perspective on the process that we're going through. The process that we've just gone through in the previous slides is described on the left-hand side of this model. It talks about doing a hierarchical card sort of the stories and then making some predictions about the relative success of different types of stories as seen by the participants. Parallel or following that process, we need to also carry out a success ranking of the most significant change stories. The focus here in a success ranking is on the outcomes rather than the configuration of context and interventions that might make a difference to the outcomes. I won't describe the ways of doing success ranking in this presentation. I'm hoping the participants will already be familiar with success ranking as a method, but if they aren't, I'm sure Jess could give a quick and useful explanation. Once we have the results from a success ranking exercise and the results from the hierarchical card sorting, we can then combine those two sets of information together to make a comparison between the predictions in the hierarchical card sorting exercise and the observations found through the success ranking. And that's what we'll see in the next slide, a way of doing that. In this next slide, we can see a scatter plot which compares two sets of rankings. On the horizontal scale are the success rankings predicted through the hierarchical card sort exercise, which focused on context and intervention aspects of the stories. And on the vertical axis, we can see the rankings observed through the success ranking exercise. And the points in the scatter plot are the stories which have been examined by both of those processes. And we can see that the stories are scattered across this scatter plot. We've got some stories, for example, in the top left quadrant, which were predicted to have to be more successful because they belong to particular types of stories, and which also in the success ranking exercise were found to be more successful. Low values on the scale means high ranking. At the other extreme, on the bottom right-hand side of the scatter plot, we can find stories which were given a low ranking in the prediction exercise and a low ranking in the success ranking exercise. And then in the other two quadrants, we've got stories which were given a low ranking in one exercise and a high ranking in the other. I've labelled these four quadrants with terms that are usually used in this sort of setting. True positives are ones where the prediction turned out to be correct. True negatives are also another category where the prediction turned out to be correct. False negatives and false positives are ones where the prediction and the success ranking exercise results differ. The stories and the types of stories they represent, which are of most interest to us, are those in the true positive and true negative quadrants. These are the potential candidate theories of change which are worth following up in more detail. Once we have a set of candidate theories of change, we can examine them in more detail. When we have large numbers of stories, it's possible that although they all belong to one type of story or configuration in that tree, not all of them have successful outcomes. In other words, there'll be some degree of inconsistency. What we should look for in candidate theories of change is where all the stories that fit that type have a high level of consistency in the outcome that we observe. We should also examine each candidate theory of change in terms of its coverage. That is, what proportion of all the stories that we have are covered by that particular theory of change. Some theories of change might only apply to a small proportion of the stories. Others might apply to a large proportion. Theories of change that apply to a large proportion of stories are probably going to be more useful. We should also examine each candidate theory of change in terms of whether there is a plausible underlying mechanism. We might have an association of attributes of the story as identified in the hierarchical card sort, but there needs to be some plausible explanation about how those things are connected in a way that leads to the outcome. We also need to think about the external validity of the candidate theory of change. Is it likely that the configuration of circumstances that we find in a particular theory of change will be found elsewhere? We might be able to make some provisional judgments about this at this stage, and if we can, that would be useful. In summary, there are 4 things we could do next when we've identified a set of candidate theories of change. We could pay attention to whether they consistently predict or are associated with a given type of outcome we're interested in. We could pay attention to what sort of coverage that theory of change has. Do they apply to lots of circumstances or a very small proportion of circumstances? And we can pay attention to how plausible the underlying causal mechanism might be, whether we can identify one and whether it's plausible. And we can also think about its likely applicability in other contexts.